I'm doing wisdom literature. I'm going to focus more on Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. I hope I said that right. So first, what is wisdom literature? I'm going to show a short clip from the Yale Bible Study. They're going to briefly go over what wisdom literature is.
To answer your question, I mean, what is it actually about it? Well, it's instructional literature. I think the first thing you notice if you look at it is it's all direct speech. Now, of course, the prophets also use direct speech, but the prophets say this is the word of the Lord, whereas the wisdom teachers more typically say, listen, my son, to your father's teaching, or at least this is good advice.
Right. So what you're pointing to then is it's a kind of instruction, a kind of knowledge that's being transmitted that is not coming directly from the deity. It's sort of more traditional folk common wisdom.
Okay, so to rephrase or sum that up, wisdom literature is not for teaching theology, but it's for learning wisdom and how to discern truth. And the Bible Project puts it into the perspective of wisdom literature attempts to answer two questions, and that is, what kind of world are we living in, and how do we live in this world well? The issue I'm going to focus on is reading the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes without taking context into consideration. So first I'm going to show you some pieces of a video that I asked a friend to send me. She just read Ecclesiastes and she was very passionate about it, so I asked her to do this. She did. So it's just her initial reaction to the book and how she viewed it, not knowing its context and not having done or not having any background knowledge on it.
But while reading through it, I felt very discouraged, and I also felt a lot of humility while doing it, which wasn't necessarily comfortable to me. So initially, without a lot of research behind the text, I've had very confusing and very disorganized thoughts about this text, because I did feel like it repeated itself many, many times to get the point in my head that things were truly meaningless and without value. And then I also read the conclusion and I felt, did I miss the whole message? So without further research, I found it very confusing to interpret it in light of the other literature wisdom.
So basically, Hannah's experience reading through Ecclesiastes for the first time left her confused and discouraged because she thought it was saying life is meaningless. Like, no matter what you do, no matter if you follow Proverbs, it doesn't mean anything. But that's without context, that's without background information. So I have a little clip that's going to explain that a little better. It's John Jorgensen. He's a YouTuber. He does Bible studies and spoken word. But he's talking about Ecclesiastes, and he brings Proverbs into it, and about how reading it out of context is really just not a good thing to do. So he's going to talk a little bit about that.
Of missing the main point of this passage because of the way that many of us read the wisdom literature in the Bible. What we so often do with the book of Proverbs and with a chapter like this is we take these little one-liners about wisdom out of their original context. And while many of these things are still good to apply to our lives in this way, we must remember that Solomon originally wrote these words in the context of trying to show his audience that wisdom, while good, cannot give us ultimate meaning and satisfaction. Time and time again, this book challenges us to remember that there are a lot of good and a lot of bad things in the world, but there are only a few things that really matter. Wisdom's really great, but it cannot be our salvation.
Something else I want to add is the book of Proverbs, the wisdom literature, in general they're not promises. They're not promising us anything, which is important to remember in Proverbs. That's one reason why so many people like, well, why do bad things happen to good people? I think that's one reason we have Ecclesiastes. Puts it into perspective, kind of like, yeah, if you read it without context, if you just read it as is without knowing anything about it, it's just like, okay, wow, life is meaningless. This contradicts the rest of the Bible or the rest of the wisdom literature. But in the end, it's telling you that, you know, what you read in Proverbs and what you see happen with Job, those aren't promises. Bad things still do happen to good people, and it's about your attitude. You know, you can't change what's happening around you, and just learning to shift our attitudes to attitudes of joy, thankfulness. You know, it all depends on how we look at it. So it's just important to remember that these are not promises, which is one reason Ecclesiastes is so important to this literary canon. Part of understanding the context is understanding the words and the context they're being used in. The word fool is used a lot in wisdom literature, and so we're just going to take a look at a little video clips from my little cousin, and she's just saying what she thinks of when she hears the word fool.
When I hear the word foolish, I think of a person who lacks knowledge.
So oftentimes we think of a fool as someone who is dumb. That was her initial reaction. She just didn't want to say it because she wanted to say it in a nicer way. Then next, I asked my aunt to kind of talk a little bit about what is a fool in the Bible. So
what foolish means, I'm reminded of Proverbs 29 verse 11. Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. Being foolish can sometimes be the difference of having a bad day, lashing out, or, venting to the wrong person. If I take my problems to God and lay them at His feet, does that make me wise?
Okay, so she talked about being wise in a specific proverb, but that is, this theoretical person who is lashing out their anger, doesn't mean they're dumb. It doesn't mean they're a dimwit. It just means that they didn't turn to God, and that made them a fool. So, a fool is not someone who's dumb or who is just silly, but it's someone who either doesn't believe in God, doesn't trust God, doesn't go to God first. It's along those lines rather than what we initially think of when we think fool. Okay, and then here's just a little clip from my other little cousin. She wanted to be a part of it because her mom and sister were. So it's just a cute little clip.
Who helps you act wise?
God.
Would you prefer to be wise or foolish?
Wise.
Okay, and that's all I really have time for. So we talked about what wisdom literature is, the issue of reading wisdom literature without context or background knowledge, and even looking at wisdom literature one book at a time rather than taking it as a whole, and how they complement each other. And then took an example of context with the word fool. All right.